My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Jim, today we got a freaking A-lister from across the pond hanging out with us, man, and we're doing things a little bit differently. You and I, we got into comics because of drawing. We wanted to grow up to draw comics. That was a sexy gig. So we've been sort of thin on writer conversations. I like to talk to the prettiest girl in the room when I go to a party. Why not start at the tippity top, man? Mark Millar, thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be the prettiest girl. I'm blushing.
Jim, rattle off some titles, man, before we get busy.
Oh, man. There's almost a before and after. Before Millar World, of course, which we know of as Wanted, Kick-Ass. Before that, Superman, Ultimates, which goes on to influence so much of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
I've heard
Civil
of it.
War, Old Man Logan. Jupiter's Legacy, one of my favorites, with Frank Quitely. So the list goes on and on. We'd be here all day if we were just going through the list of books that Mark has written. But chances are everybody who's watching this knows some of his work.
Hey, Mark, here's a question, man. Are Jim and I idiots because we elected to draw our comics that we also write, man?
Well, no, every writer is a failed artist. Like, I'm a failed artist. Like, I really wanted to draw comics. Like, no kid ever sits down and thinks, I'm going to write a script. You know, when you're 5, you don't get the pens and the paper and the colouring stuff and everything. You don't think, I'm going to write the best damn 36-page script ever. You know, you're like, I'm going to do the best drawing of Batman, or I'm going to do the best drawing of Superman. So as a kid, I just wanted to be a comic book artist. And there's actually, I don't know if I've ever told this story, but I accidentally became a writer when I was 18. And I heard that, you know who Dick Giordano is? You know, like he used to run DC back in the 80s. And this is what I love about you guys, actually. I'm so used to doing mainstream interviews that I have to say, do you know who Dick Giordano is?
The audience can keep up too, man. So don't feel the need to, like add those little preambles, man. They'll keep up.
This is what I love about Kayfabe. But Dick Giordano was coming to London, and this was really exciting. I was a teenager. I was just at high school. And he was looking for artists, and he was going along to this place called the Society of Strip Illustrators in London. So I went down with a couple of pals and sort of blagged my way in. I wasn't a member or anything. And I remember having my portfolio, my art portfolio with me, and I was like, I'm going to be drawing Batman. I'm going to be working at DC. This is awesome. And I was standing in a line, and it was kind of like a meat market. You know, there was like 100 guys, you know, with their portfolios under their arms.
Mark, real quick, can I ask, is this like the fateful time Dick Giordano comes there and like gets Alan Moore for the first time? Is it?
Oh
like
my God, no. That was years before. You know, he was onto the dregs by the time it was me. This is maybe, I was 18, so maybe 1988 or something, a little bit later.
Okay.
So I'm just like desperate to work in comics, you know, coming out of high school, nothing I want more in the world. And I remember just having this folder, and I was so proud of it, you know, because I was like the best artist in my class, which is a bit different from being on a global stage, you know. So I remember having my little folder, and the guy in front of me was a guy called David Hine, who I'm now friendly with, you know. But Dave actually had a leather-bound case, and it had a zip. And I had a little paper folder that mine was in, and all of my artwork was drawn on square maths paper with, you know, like a cheap pen, and all of his stuff was beautifully inked and all laid out. And I looked at everyone else and I thought, oh my God, these guys are like adults, you know. And I was so embarrassed. And I'd drawn a Green Lantern flying out towards you and everything, and it just looked like a child, you know. And I remember just closing my thing up and thinking, right, I have to do something else, you know. And I'd dabbled in writing a little bit. I'd sent proposals into DC when I was 12 and 13 and everything. But I said I would do anything. Like, I was just willing to work in comics in any capacity. And then when I got to Giordano, I'd formulated a pitch for a creeper story. So I just gave him my idea for a creeper story, and it started a little bit of a relationship with DC Comics. But I, like all writers, I'm a failed artist.
There are 2 Mark Millar stories that I know, that I've sort of heard firsthand. One is the famous Dave Gibbons story where Dave is doing signings for Watchmen, and a teenage Mark Millar comes up, perhaps around the same age as the kid who visited Dick Giordano, and basically told Dave, listen, man, I know what the next comic is you need to write. I'm working on the script for it right now. So that's like the one story. Other story, Jim, you and I, we were on some travels. I'm not going to name the guy's name just because finances are involved, but homeboy hung out with us, sat with us and said, yeah, Mark approached me this one time and said, blankety blank, I just want to make you a millionaire. ... ellipsis. And he did. Mark, we in the city here, I'm going to teach you some Pittsburgh slang, man. We call that big dick energy, man. Like you got the 50-pound nuts. That's awesome.
Well, that was what whenever I would contact an artist for Millar World, the first couple of things did well. Like Wanted was the first book, became a movie. Third book was Kick-Ass, became a movie and everything, and brought a lot of money in for the creative team. And I just thought my pitch to artists, and this is why I always got the best guys, as I would always contact them. And I've got such an eye for artists, right? I mean, we're all comic fans. We know the good from the bad, right? So I would always go for the best guys. And I would say, listen, you can work for Marvel and DC and be 1,000 there, or you can come and work with me and become a millionaire, And I used that was my pitch to them, and they would be like, okay, let's do it, and they all did, every Millar World guy.
50-pound nuts.
Mark, we talked to a lot of artists about collaboration, and so you mentioned picking some of the best artists to work with. Are there certain things that you look for in an artist? Do you look for specific artists for specific ideas? Like, do you write to artists the way a screenwriter might write for an actor?
It's a really interesting question, because for me, the artist is the most important part of the equation. It always is. And any writer that says otherwise is a liar. A big book, always has an artist behind it, really. There's a few exceptions, but generally art sells your book. And if you work with a big artist, you will sell more than if you're working with a lesser well-known artist, But I tend to actually just take it a project at a time, So like, I'll have a project I want to write, a comic that I want to do that I'm in love with. And I just think, who's the best possible guy for this? A bit like casting a movie, so you've come up with James Bond and you think, okay, I'm looking at James Mason, I'm looking at David Niven, I'm looking at Sean Connery, I'll go for Sean Connery, So it's like, who's appropriate to the project that you're working on? Like Starlight's a very good example. Like I had this idea for an old man Flash Gordon type project, And I thought, who'd be good for that? And I didn't want to do something too American. For some reason, I knew it had to be European, and I wanted it to have a Mobius kind of feel to it. And I was thinking, well, what's like Mobius, but not a swipe of Mobius? It feels like its own thing. So it just Goran seemed like a perfect choice. Goran Parlov. Nobody except Goran could have drawn that as beautifully as he did. And who knew that he had a great sci-fi project in him? But I just instinctively knew he was the man. As soon as I started looking through his stuff in my tea break, Google imaging his stuff and looking through sketches he'd done, I was like, this is the guy, it's him. And I think 9 times out of 10, I think I tend to choose the right guy. Sometimes I've worked with people who are brilliant artists, but they're maybe not ideal for the project. I think generally we've synced really well. And I think the trick is to always work with somebody more talented than you are, So I've always sought out the guys who are my heroes, and tried to work with them.
Are you pretty rigid when it comes to what you want from the artist? Like if we, we go down the line and we start to accumulate lots of these interviews, we start to talk to some of your collaborators, are they going to be like, Mark Millar, man, he's a tough customer?
Well, I always think I'm really easy. And then the artists, well, maybe 5 of them are in the bar with me or something like that. And they'll be like, oh man, your scripts are like the hardest ever. and then they all agree. And I'm like, well, if there's a group of them saying this, they must be correct. It must be true. I'm obviously wrong, But like, what I'll do is I'll say to them, and when I look back through the scripts ever since they pointed this out, I can't unsee this now. But I always say, turn the page to the greatest splash page in the history of mankind and everything. So I'll always like set the bar really high and say, right, make this the best thing you've ever drawn. And then 4 pages later, panel 4, I'll be like, make this the best thing you've ever drawn, So like, I'm always trying to get the best out of them, but it's only because I'm so into it, and I think it's kind of contagious because it does tend to bring out the best work in these guys. I mean, I've been really lucky. Like when I was working with each artist, it feels like, the best I've ever seen them do. Like I've never got pages back really disappointed. I've actually always been delighted.
You're right. It's probably up to them to answer that question. Frank Whiteley, JR, get in touch. Let's do lunch.
Frank Whiteley, I mean, he lives nearby. He's a friend of mine in Scotland as well. And he says, I hate doing your stuff. It's like so hard, because everybody else balances it out with maybe 4 pages of action and then a 6-page talking heads scene or something. And it just makes his life worth living, Whereas for me, it's just relentless. If this was a movie, it would cost $600 million. It would be impossible.
Another piece of the collaborative puzzle is like an editor and also publisher. And, you've published with virtually everyone. I wonder how you think about editors and publishers, if you have an editor you trust, or if that's something, well, you tell me.
That's a really good question. Like, there's lots of different types of editors. I mean, I've worked in the industry a long time now. You know, I mean, 3 decades. I was 19 when I started. 19 pretty much full time from then, and I've worked with all different types of editors. There's the strict authoritarian editor who will play games with you, which is horrible. You know, like you don't really hear much about this, but this is a culture that used to exist within comics. And when you're at a certain level in your career, it can be soul destroying. You know, I mean, I've been there. You know, I was that guy in my 20s, and not all of them. I mean, I had some wonderful guys I worked with as well, but there was guys who would literally just mess with you. You know, just because they were bored. You know, like, and I'll give you a perfect example. I wrote a script for something one time, and the editor, you know, I did a good job. You know, you can tell you've done a good one. And I'd written a load of rubbish around about it, but this was like one good script. And this editor said to me, that's a really good script you've done. I'm really delighted. And I was like, that's great, thanks. I'm happy with it. And he says, there's just one point. And I was like, what is it? And he says, this story thing doesn't really make sense, this thing on page 18 or something. And I was like, oh, no, it refers to this thing on page 4. And he was like, oh, right, okay. And then he was so annoyed that I'd sort of told him something he'd missed. I'd never encountered this before, that he said, actually, I think this script's terrible. The whole thing's a mess. He said, I'm going to rewrite this. He said, I'll get back to you. And then like 3 months passed and I didn't hear anything from him, right? Oh my God. And like every penny counted. I mean, I was living check to check at the time. It was a nightmare. So I was desperate for any backup strip or anything that came along. And then, but this was in fax times, you know, before email and everything, you know, I got a fax of the issue through. And it had been drawn exactly as I described, but every word of dialogue had been redialogued, and it was like a total mess. And it didn't even make sense. And the guy had just done it as an exercise in control. So I then went on the phone, and I remember at the time I was so conscious. I put a clock in front of me, so conscious of the cash, that I put a clock in front of me because it was really expensive to call America from Scotland. And I went through it, and it took 3 hours to untangle this guy's rewrite back to where I was, you know. So there's that type of editor, which is like a nightmare, you know. Then there's the guys who make stupid suggestions, but are generally okay, you know. Then there's the guys who are really good, who are brilliant, you know. And then there's the ones who don't really do much at all. And as you go through your career, you know, the sort of, as you hit a certain point when your book's selling really well, they tend to lay off you. And I think I generally work best in that environment because I'm quite tough on myself. I'm not the sort of guy that hands in a first draft. You know, like I'll spend 2 weeks on average on a comic script. If you look back over my career, I write about 18 or 19 comics a year. It looks like a lot I'm doing, but it's actually not. You know, like I rarely have 2 books out a month. You know, it's always just under 2 a month. And I think by the time I've handed it in, I've memorized the script. Like I know it so well. I've shaved it down. I've chopped scenes, clipped a panel here, combined panels, everything. I've got it pretty tight by that point. So editors, really since I was about 30, you know, ever since about 1999, 2000, I've been sort of left to my own devices, which is great. But prior to that, it was quite hard. Some exceptions though. I mean, a guy like Archie Goodwin bought my first ever DC script. And I remember having lunch with him. He came to Glasgow, like, believe it or not, DC used to come over to Glasgow, which seems incredible now, you know, but there was just so much money at the company. I think in the old days, they would send everybody in these jollies all over Europe and everything, you know, so all the editors used to have a great time in Paris and they'd do London and come up to Glasgow for no reason except to come out for a drink for 5 days and everything. And I was maybe 21 at the time, 22, and Archie Goodwin was coming to Glasgow, and I was, oh my God, you know, so I contacted him and arranged to meet him for lunch because I'd had a couple of things in 2008 at the time. And I sat with him, and I think I learned more in that 90 minutes over lunch than like the rest of my career, you know, because the guy was a master at what he did. And I had this Batman story that he really liked, and he made a couple of suggestions. And you know, when somebody just hits the chisel in exactly the right place, and he was like, that'll make your story better. And I was like, 150% right, it's great, you know. So I mean, but guys like that is so rare. I mean, the old system used to be really good where you would be a writer, and then once you'd learned your craft, you had a paid salaried job as an editor. And I kind of missed that a little bit, you know, like back in the 60s and the 70s, the editors knew the ropes. A lot of them had been around the industry 20, 30 years. They'd been writers or artists themselves. And I think it brought something to it. But there's a lot of good editors out there, though. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Can we ask some craft stuff? Because we have been pretty artist-driven here. And Jim and I, you know, we got into the game with art in mind. So for myself personally, I'm trying to catch up as a writer, and I've been absorbing so many books and master classes. And one one thing where there seems to be this like line of demarcation when it comes to like designing characters. Some writers, guys like for film usually, David Mamet, Aaron Sorkin, they say that it's just magical thinking if you kind of create a backstory for your characters and try to flesh them out before you get started with the actual script.
Yeah.
Guys like Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, at least the Alan Moore that wrote that 1986 set of essays, like right before Watchmen, he goes as far as like acting out, you know, the character's life in front of a mirror. You know, maybe that's kayfabe or not. But so we have two people who say that that's a waste of time. We have two people, comics related guys, who say that there's value in that. What's your approach to designing characters?
I start everything with a drawing because it's a visual medium, you know. So and like I say, because I draw anyway, you know, like I'll give you an example. Old Man Logan's a good example. When I was doing Wolverine, I was doodling and just I'll sometimes spend 2-3 days between projects just doodling. I'll just sit and I'll draw 200 pages. You know, I'll just sit and do mad sketches of anything, you know. And in amongst it all, I'll find something kind of interesting. And in the corner of a page, I drew this little picture of Wolverine with grey hair. Just with completely grey hair and just looking old and looking tired. And then I drew like, you know, farm stuff around him and everything. And I drew, he had no claws, and I drew him with a farm around him. I was like, this is kind of interesting. Wolverine's an old man. He's living on a farm now. He hasn't popped his claws in a long time and everything. And the story grew organically from there. You know, that Unforgiven sort of take of a guy who was the man with no name in the past, which is what Wolverine emerged from, really, you know, and becoming a legend, and then a myth, and then forgotten, you know, and that just seemed really interesting to me. And I thought, okay, how did it end up in that situation? So I grew the stories organically from there, and I started to really sort of flesh him out, like where he had been at that point. Kick-Ass was the same. Kick-Ass started with a drawing I had of somebody in a superhero costume trying it for the first time and getting stabbed on his first night. Before he even threw his first punch, he's stabbed, and then some other guy hits him, and then he gets run over by a car. And I did that drawing, and then I was thinking, okay, who is this kid then, you know? And I was thinking, well, if he likes superheroes so much, he must be a comic book fan if he's dressing up as superheroes, you know? He's a cosplayer, really, you know? And he's actually got a sort of intrinsic moral sort of decency in there as well, because he's actually wanting to go out and look after his neighborhood. You know, is he lonely? Is he maybe somebody who is isolated? You know, has he lost somebody in his family? So the whole sort of character started to emerge of his mum had died and all this kind of stuff, you know? So I'll sit and plan that stuff for weeks before I start writing something. When I was doing Jupiter's Legacy, I worked out the mythology of all the characters for 2 months, and I'd post-it notes all over my room. And the thing that was really annoying, actually, is Frank Whiteley was at a party in my house, and he rearranged all my notes at the party when he came into the room. And I said to him, like, this is so important, and I'm making sure the kids don't touch this. And then he got in and changed it all, and he wrote like really horrible notes and everything and put them up in amongst my notes, you know. And like, but I worked out the backstories. I worked out who their parents were, everything. And it didn't even make it into the story, but I knew who they were. I knew what their favorite food was. I knew what newspaper this guy read. I knew what music this guy was listening to in 1929. I knew everything about the characters. So much so, actually, that the companion series then seemed inevitable, because I only ever planned to do Jupiter's Legacy. But the prequel series, which has turned out massively important in the television show, I mean, that's half the television show. The prequel series was really easy to write because everybody's backstory was there. So it can be really rewarding and really fun, actually. I love fleshing all that. And the idea of just jumping in there and, you know, making them ciphers or something, it doesn't seem that appealing to me. You know, I like to know who they are. They've got to be 3D.
What's the next step, Mark, after you're getting in this planning process? Are you writing directly to script? Are you breaking down story? You know, we hear about writers doing it on index cards. There's obviously people work from outlines as opposed to seat of your pants.
I'd say it changed actually when I started working in film. Up until then, I used to do seat of the pants, and I really revolutionized the way I wrote once I started working in film, because what happened was I'd maybe have a 3-part story, and part 1 would work out good, part 2 would work out good. Then I only had a tiny amount of space to do part 3, but the artist was already drawn to an issue 1 had been lettered, and then I'd go back and try and fix it, and I'd beg them to redraw a panel or something. And I realised this is a horrible way of working, you know. And I think my life completely changed once I started working in film, and I thought, I should treat everything like an actual story with a beginning, middle, and end. And I quite like the way Frank Miller does it, you know, where he just goes in and tells a story. I kind of hate things that go on for 100 issues and everything, you know, like I see the value in it, but it's just not for me, you know, and I know there's fallow patches and everything. I love the way Miller just comes in like an assassin. He comes in, tells the story, and gets the hell out of Dodge, you know, and he's giving you the best Batman story in 4 issues you've ever read in your life, you know. And I was growing up, I loved that, and I've always been really inspired by that. And I just think from the reader's point of view, it's good too, isn't it, to have something with no fat on it, you know. So I've started approaching my stories maybe the last 10, 15 years like that too, where what I do is I figure out the ending first, actually. You know, so I've done all the drawing, I've done all my designs, all the things I'm thinking of that the artist will improve upon. But then what I do is I sit and block it out and I plan the story meticulously, you know, so that I can actually verbally say it out loud from beginning to end. And I don't even need to say it to anyone, but just so that I can say it to myself, and I run through the whole thing. And I can see it then in front of me, and I know the beats, and I know that this needs picked up a little here, this needs shaved a little here. The ending is smaller than the beginning, so I need to, you know, do something to enlarge the ending and make the ending feel as if there's a sense of escalation running through the story. So I treat it like it's like a sculpture. You know, I have the whole thing there in front of me, and once I'm really confident with it, then I go and I sit with my wife, who's a really, really excellent editor. You know, and not in the comic book sense, but in the sense she'll be honest. You know, and if something makes sense, not even so much do you like this idea, because she's not necessarily into the stuff I'm into, you know, in terms of comic books, but it's like, does this make any sense? Does this seem out of character for this character? And to her eternal credit, she'll sit there for like an hour and a half or something while I say, okay, right, so it starts like this, and I'll run through the whole thing. And then you can see her sort of thinking, and she'll be like, I feel that's a little too much. And then I'll rein it back in a little bit. And then once I have something that I'm really happy with, then I start typing. And that can be weeks. And I deliver 6 issues at once to the artist. So the artist gets all 6 scripts, and it's in stone by that point. You know, it's like, I know there's nothing I can change. It's as good as I can possibly get.
One of the common things that come up in all the discussions that I read about the craft of writing, it seems that most writers agree that at the moment when you're constructing a narrative, inevitably there's a moment where you get stuck, or as we say, you know, you write yourself into a corner. They all say that is great, because this is, if you can't figure out how to get out of it, the reader can't figure out how to get out of it either. So now this is where the real writer comes in and solves the problem. Can you speak to that in any of your works specifically?
I think that's how I worked, certainly in the first 10 years of my career. But what I learned to do was to reverse engineer. And I thought I invented this. And then I found out that loads of people do this. You know, like Stephen Moffat, who writes Doctor Who, works this way, and Alan Moore works this way as well. But what I would do is work out my ending. So I would work out my solution before I created the problem. And it makes you look like a genius, you know, because people think, wow, he's so clever, he tied everything up. But it's like, no. It was already, it's a magician's trick, you know, like I've got it all worked out, everything's fine. And then you create jeopardy at the beginning of your story, but in reality, you know exactly where it's going, you know the path. And it's like a qualification. If you think about it, if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or something, you pick the relevant degree that takes you to that place. I think it does us good to know our destination at the beginning of a story. I think the reader doesn't know it, you can disguise it. But I think we ultimately want to know where we're going to end up, I think, with the story. So I love that, and I love hiding it, and I love taking the reader down little avenues and everything. But I always know where I'm going at the end, and it looks great. Whenever everything all comes together, you're like, And I'll tell you, here's the most valuable thing that I've discovered over the years, is that quite often when you work in comics, when you've got a finite number of pages and a certain amount of space, it's not like film. It's a bit more like a song or like TV, where it's clipped, you know, it's got to be in a very specific amount of time, is that you can end up rushing your story if you've only got one more issue to wrap everything up in. But if you do your ending first and then work your way back, your endings are never rushed, your endings are perfect. And if you need to clip any space, clip the beginning. Because nobody ever moans about a beginning that went on too quickly. You know, nobody's, that beginning was just way too rushed. But they do complain about endings that are too rushed. So use space at the end and have the bare bones at the beginning, just what you need to draw people into the story.
Mark, you mentioned film in your experience in film. Mm-hmm. Thinking about talking to you, I find your work very cinematic, which in comics, sometimes that's a virtue and sometimes it's not, depending on your point of view. I'm curious when that enters your work. You know, like I think of Authority as being known as like, you know, widescreen comics. And I guess this would have been about 20 years ago at this point. But I don't know can you talk a little bit about the influence of film on your work in terms of a certain type of storytelling, maybe in scale, maybe in archetypes? Does that make sense?
Do you know, it's funny, a lot of people say that to me, but film is such a broad thing, isn't it? You know, like film is like an obscure Czechoslovakian poetry movie or something like that, you know, but it's also Michael Bay, you know, it's like film's everything in the same way that comics is everything, you know. So, I mean, I think what people mean when they say that sometimes is blockbuster, you know, something that's got a lot of explosions and a big third act set piece and everything, you know. But that's just the way I've always worked, you know. It's like Alex Ross has got a very cinematic style. You know, mainstream people can really understand Alex Ross's work. When I show I love doing experiments, you know, and I'll put loads of comics out in front of all sorts of people, you know. And the stuff that kids respond to is Rob Liefeld. Like kids adore. I mean, kids in 1995, kids in 2005, 2015, the kids in my family all love Rob Liefeld. It's timeless, you know. And adults, you know, like hardcore comic fans will rag on him, you know, but he absolutely speaks to young teens and kids. They love the energy. Alex, you show Alex's stuff to sort of mainstream adult audience, and they think it's the best thing they've ever seen in their life, you know, because it's pure Americana and they can just totally get all the points of reference, you know. And I think my writing's maybe on some level a little like that. It's quite easy to understand. It's quite filmic in the sense that, you know, one panel follows the other. You know, it's like it's a 4-panel page. Usually it's on a kind of grid. And nobody's confused. You know, it's kind of like a film. It rolls a little like a movie. The language of comics can be very sophisticated, and especially in non-comics people. I think if you're a writer-artist, that's easy, but I think if you're a writer, it's really hard to describe to an artist what you want to pull off. You know, like if you're Frank Miller or Bernie Krigstein or something like that, you know, you can play around with this stuff, and it's all you, isn't it? But if you're a writer, I think to make it clear for the artist, I think I've tended to veer towards making it as simple as possible and put the energy and the unusual ideas into what's in the panels themselves, you know, the actual layout of the book. I try to make as easy as possible. So I think that can make it look a bit like film storyboards and everything as well. And I tend to go for artists that work well within that structure too. So it looks less like an indie book, and it looks a little bit more like a big Marvel summer event or something, you know, the type of stuff I tend to do.
Did you just mention Frank Miller or Bernie Krigstein? Was that your second reference there?
Yeah.
When did you come across Bernie Krigstein work? Was that something you encountered as a kid in EC reprints? Or he's one of my favorite artists, so to hear those two in a sentence kind of makes sense, but we don't hear it very often. So tell me about Bernie Krigstein.
I mean, you can see Krigstein's influence in Miller completely, you know. Like, I actually discovered Krigstein when I was about 12 or 13. And what it was, you know, when you're just becoming obsessed with comics, you know, you're reading everything. There was a magazine, I don't know if you got it in the States, called Daredevils. Have you ever heard of the Daredevils? It was a black and white UK magazine from Marvel UK.
Heard of it, but it was never here.
It was a kind of companion to Warrior. So the guys who were doing Warrior were also the guys doing Daredevil. So you had like Alan Moore and Alan Davis doing Miracle Man, you know. And then in the Marvel UK Daredevils, they were doing Captain Britain, which has been collected. I'm sure you guys have read it. But Alan Moore, I mean, this is gold. You should check this out, by the way. You should check it out. Because Alan Moore wrote essays in it, like every month. So he would write like 2 or 3 essays and a short story. He would do a Night Raven pulp short story or something, you know, at the same time as doing an essay on Bernie Krigstein, a 4-page essay on Bernie Krigstein, or like his appreciation of Frank Miller, this new guy who just started working in America, who was kind of a contemporary of Moore's and seemed to be doing what he was doing with superheroes over in America. So my introduction to a lot of stuff that was maybe a little different from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby and all the reprints that we were reading in the UK was through this magazine. And then I discovered fandom through that, you know, and that led me on to all these other guys. Then I would find the Hernandez brothers, Robert Crumb, all that stuff. So the stuff that they weren't selling in newsagents, my gateway drug was Alan Moore writing these essays in the back of the Daredevils monthly magazine. It didn't last very long. You know, sometimes quality doesn't sell on the newsstands, and the magazine is phenomenal. It's so good. but it was aimed for guys like us as opposed to everybody, which is the newsstand. To survive in the newsstand, you've got to appeal to hundreds of thousands of people, even in a country as small as the UK, back in those days especially. So the magazine tanked, but it's like gold. I mean, check it out. Everything in it is brilliant. It's so good.
I like hearing all those other names you just mentioned as well, man. The Crumbs and the Los Bros Hernandez. It puts my thoughts in a certain direction, and I wonder what you would consider to be success. Like, is the financial part of it the most important? And I guess the real question is, guys like the Los Bros, they're clearly not commercially minded. Like, in a lot of ways, like they've been just doing their Love and Rockets thing, getting a lot of offers to do all sorts of other stuff. You know, DC would love to have Jaime Hernandez draw a Wonder Woman comic or something like that. He's like, nah, he's just doing his thing. Is the financial part of it a decision maker for what you choose to put out into the world, or do you have some like really kind of like artsy fartsy esoteric stuff that's like you're waiting for the right time? Or
no, I'm lucky that what I'm interested in tends to be quite commercial, Like, I remember being asked in a very early interview in my 20s, just when these things would pop up occasionally, which was rare back in those days because nobody's that interested in the guy starting out. But somebody said to me, I think it was from Time Out in London, what's your top 5 movies? And I was like, Jaws, Superman, Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And like one of my friends who was with me said, don't say that, pretend it's like some French film so they think you're smarter than you are. And I was like, I'm just about myself though, so I mean, this is what I love, So I'm really fortunate that I'm not one of those guys who's doing Spider-Man the whole time thinking, I want to do something more like Jean-Luc Godard, It's like I'm lucky that this is what I love, this is what I really enjoy doing. But I've got an appreciation of everything. I mean, my collection is so wide, but you veer towards what you're good at, I guess, So for me, I think I'll try and bring an odd sensibility, I think, to superheroes, even though they're mainstream. Like Kick-Ass, for example, opens a bit like a Robert Crumb comic. It's a lame superhero who has no powers. I mean, if it was drawn by the Hernandez brothers, it would make perfect sense. He's masturbating in the opening scene. This isn't Spider-Man immediately. This isn't Spider-Man. There's a guy commits suicide in the opening scene and he gets run over by a car at the end of the first issue. It's like, but when John Romita Jr. draws it, it makes it look like a big commercial comic. So I guess my sensibilities are a little bit skewed, but I also do revel in the mainstream, and I never feel ashamed of the mainstream. Like I do love it. Like my heroes, like Kirby, Kurt Swan, like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. These are all guys who did their best work really in the mainstream, and it doesn't have to be crass. It doesn't have to be cheap. It can be absolutely beautiful. Like my favorite Neil Adams work is like his Lois Lane covers and his Jimmy Olsen covers and everything. Like there's nothing cool about that stuff or anything, but it's just brilliant. It's perfect.
We took this screenwriting course to just try to bone up on our writing skills over last summer when we started writing some new comics we're working on at this moment. And one of the tenets that the teachers tried to like beat into our heads was that every scene should do 2 or 3 things at once. Like if it's not accomplishing several different tasks for the narrative, especially the lean nature of a television episode or something, then it needs to be clipped. Do you believe in that philosophy, and is that something that you employ or do not employ in, like, say, a pamphlet-sized comic book?
I don't think you can think like that. Like I think it's instinctive. Everything's from your gut. Like I remember weirdly the editor I was telling you about, who was the authoritarian guy. He said to me, I've realized the secret of a good comic script. And I was like, what is it? He said, a guy should have to make a decision about 2/3 of the way through the story. And I was like, what? And he gave me some examples of good stories that had a guy making a decision about 2/3 of the way through the story. He said, well, there you go. There's the building blocks of a great story. And I was like, that applied to those stories. It doesn't necessarily apply to every story, And I think sometimes we can overanalyze when what we should always do is write with our stomach instead of writing with our head. So I think you know when a scene is right. So I don't think it has to do 3 things at once. I think a scene doing one thing is pretty good. If it can do one thing, that's more, and do one thing well, it's better than most scenes. But I do think a comic generally, a very simple rule that I think Stan Lee had, was something should happen between page 1 and page 24 that moves the story forward. Because I can't think of many examples where that doesn't hold true, but I've sometimes read comics where that doesn't happen. And I'll watch TV shows, and you get quite frustrated watching TV shows that it doesn't seem to be moving forward. So I do think there's something in us that we like a beginning to be smaller than an ending. You feel more satisfied if your journey goes like that. So if the third act is bigger than your first act, you feel good. And it's just a very simple rule. And I think the story moving forward between the beginning and the end in any kind of serial is important.
Mark, I'm not sure the best way to ask this question, so I'm just going to be clumsy and we'll try to field our way through it. You strike me as being maybe the most successful cartoonist, writer of comics, somebody coming out of the Marvel DC mold, possibly the most successful of all time. I wonder if you've given thought to what distinguishes you, if there are, if you've identified any specific traits or qualities or strategies that separate you from your peers.
I'm the least self-analytical guy. Like I never even look back at my old stuff, so it's always quite hard to judge. And I never really sort of look at myself, like, I don't know, there's so much going on around, I can never have the time to indulge. I mean, I kind of like the idea of it, but I never actually take the time to actually think, okay, what did I do right? That kind of thing, But I do hear other people make interesting observations, So I'm always too busy. There's the kids, there's work, all the sort of real life stuff and everything. But you do find other people chatting about you, which is quite weird, that you see online or sometimes in meetings. And I remember a studio head said to me that one thing that works very well with my stuff is what's going on in the story. Which sounds crazy, right? But he says he gets so many comics that float across their desk and he's no idea what's going on. He hasn't a clue. Like, it's, part 17 of a 36-part crossover. There's maybe one cool shot in it or something like that, but what the hell's this even about, And it sounds crazy, but I mean, maybe it's as simple as that you kind of know what my stories are about. Like Wolverine hasn't popped his claws for years. He comes back for one last mission. Kick-Ass. Imagine a kid who loved superheroes so much in real life, he tried to be one, and what happens next, So I think it's maybe quite simple ideas. They're quite straightforward. And I think that's what made Stan work, and it was what made the Golden Age DC characters work as well. There was nothing too convoluted. It was just very, very straightforward. And I think maybe a bit of fun to them as well, And the big thing that makes them work as movies, directors have told me, is that there's a lot of good scenes. So, like, there's a lot of moments. Like Stanley Kubrick says, a good movie has got 8 moments that you can talk about afterwards. And if it's got more, fantastic. But if you've got 8 moments, you've got a really good movie. And I don't do it counting it like that, but I do notice a graphic novel, for example, like a 6-part graphic novel, it's probably got a good 10, 12 really good scenes in it, that will translate and tend to translate, whether it's the barroom brawl in Kingsman or something like this, or, any one of these things, I'll try and do at least every issue of a comic, 4 scenes per issue, 2 of them quite memorable ones. And sometimes you can go a wee bit over the top, but that's your job. I mean, it's comics, it's crazy, like nobody looks like Jack Kirby characters, but what made them cool is that they looked, they looked awesome. So I'll try and do the same thing with writing. I'll try and come up with the most outrageous scenes that I can work, but also try and blend it in the human elements too. So I don't know. I mean, that's me just like sort of picking what other people have said to me over the years. But I've never. When I'm an old guy, I think I'll maybe look back and try and figure out, how it worked. I'm glad it worked, and I know that for the first 10 years it didn't, which was really weird. Like you only kind of notice people whenever they blow up. I mean, I was writing, those Who's Who pages you get at the back of DC Comics. I was writing like the text for Who's Who pages because I remember you got, I think it was $90 for each one of those pages, and I was like, could really use those $90. And I was like, can I write 2 more of those Who's Who pages? So, I was writing everything just to keep my head above the water through my whole 20s. And I was doing things like Swamp Thing, Superman Adventures and everything, but nobody was reading these things. I mean, I really worked my ass off, but I was always like 500 copies above cancellation. So like, I remember I used to phone my editors every month and say, are we cancelled yet? And they'd be like, no, the sales are still 500 over cancellation. Got another month. And I'd be like, I can pay my bills, I can keep doing comics, which is all I cared about doing, you know. So then whenever it did blow up for me and things did get really good, like after Authority led the way into Ultimate X-Men, which was a #1 book when it launched, which gave me a huge power at Marvel to launch at #1. It was amazing, you know, and the fact that Joe had brought me in and Joe was reinventing Marvel at the time, then I got to do Ultimates, and then there was Ultimate War came from there, and then Wolverine, Enemy of the State with John Romita Jr. and everything. So everything I was doing was selling lots of copies, Ultimate Fantastic Four. So they kind of let me crack on and do what I wanted. I was making good dough and everything. But I appreciated it every day, and I still do. I mean, I really do honestly remember it so well, the 10, 11 years of nothing happening. Like nobody phoning me, nobody wanting me to really to do anything, just standing around at conventions hoping to catch the eye of an editor at the bar when somebody else had stopped talking to him and trying to get to know him and tell him my idea for this book that he didn't want, you know. And it's still so strong in me, you know, that there isn't a day where I don't ever appreciate how lucky I am now, you know.
I love that story, the Who's Who one-pagers. It always, anytime I hear about this, I always think of Harvey Kurtzman doing like the one-pagers in old Marvel comics, like the Hey Looks and stuff, because nobody wanted those. You know, like they were the scraps. That was all that he could get, but then he makes gold out of it. So that's fun.
When I was a student at the Kubert School, I got a hold of a Mark Millar script that somebody brought in, man, and it was a part of one of our assignments, and I was looking through my portfolio trying to find it to dust it off and see if we could revisit it, but I couldn't find it. It was this issue where we had to draw the first 3 pages, and it's a magician in a church, and he puts the priest goes in the box, and then, you know, abracadabra, when the box opens, like locusts like swarm the church and everything.
That was Swamp Thing 144. Swamp Thing 144. I always remember it like because every one of those issues was like a lifesaver. I remember I think it was pretty much DC's lowest paid guy, but I was so happy to be getting a monthly check and doing comics, because there was so many times in my 20s that I thought it was going to stop. You know what it's like, you know, when you're a freelance guy, you're like, what if this ends now? And the thing that was funny with that was it was actually my first solo published DC book. Although I'd sold the Batman script to Archie Goodwin, it lay in a drawer for 4 years because Archie had bought up so much inventory. It didn't come out for like 4 years. So that was my first thing that came out. And I remember thinking, I've hit the big time. This is amazing. I'm working at DC Comics. And the industry actually collapsed that month, pretty much that month. Like you had the Image guys and everything all doing brilliantly. And then 94 came along and the industry just completely collapsed. And then it halved again in 95. And it was like an earthquake. We were like, what? So I was just breaking into the industry as a young 20-something. And the whole thing almost went away. So I was like nervous for 10 years. It was really hard.
At a certain point, I have to imagine that you started to, as your name equity builds and you start to sell more books and get more recognition, at one point do you become like a 5-year plan guy who could then begin to design his own career?
You know, it's funny actually. I only had a plan to work in comics to do the stuff I loved growing up. It was really interesting actually, because this was never my plan. My plan was just to do Superman. You know, like that was the thing I really, really, really loved. And I was a DC guy. Like it was all to do with distribution. Like I think whatever bands you're into or whatever movies you're into is basically down to what you were exposed to as a kid. So I was exposed to DC Comics because my local stores, you know, just the local grocery stores had lots of DC and they had no Marvel. There was some Marvel UK stuff, but the Marvel UK stuff quite often was 20 years late. It was like kind of black and white reprints of amazing stuff like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko kind of stuff. So I grew up thinking of that as contemporary Marvel in the early 80s. In Scotland, I was reading black and white reprints of Steve Ditko's Spider-Man every month, you know. But the DC stuff was really, really easy to come by. I think there was nine grocery stores in my hometown that used to bring out DC books. So I grew up absolutely loving that. And my ambition was just to write Superman, Batman, Justice League, all that kind of stuff. But I just got into the industry for that. And then DC I wasn't a good fit at DC. Like I worked in 2000 AD to get into DC, and I thought, okay, I've got the crown. And it was one of those things where I'm in DC, then the industry collapses. Then I looked around and I thought, I don't really like any of the books these guys are doing. You know, like nothing really exciting me. There was some amazing stuff in there, like Mark Waid was doing great stuff. He was doing The Flash and Impulse and all that stuff in the 90s. It was great. And Kurt Busiek was doing brilliant stuff over at Marvel. But there was a lot of stuff that I just wasn't into. It just didn't feel like me. And I found myself slightly more drawn towards the Vertigo stuff. You know, you had some really, really good guys working at Vertigo. And I found myself slightly falling out of love with it a little bit. And I didn't quite click with the authoritarian nature of the DC Universe editorial. Like I said, you know, there was quite a bullying structure. I think it had come from the people who'd worked at Marvel before that, who were now working at DC, and they were pretty authoritarian guys, you know. And I didn't quite click with it. So then I thought, well, this is probably not going to happen for me. And I was almost on the way out of the industry in the late 90s. And I sold a television show to Channel 4 in the UK, a vampire TV show. And I'd never considered working in television. I'd only ever wanted to work in comics. And then The Authority became available. And I ended up going in and doing The Authority. But it was a total accident. This was never like a genius plan or anything. And then Marvel poached me from there, which made it look as if I'd had this fantastic career move. But it was just because The Authority was hot. Marvel came in and poached me. One book after another, Marvel did well. And then suddenly I was writing all these huge books. But it was this, I've probably written more Marvel comics than I've read. You know, like I was never really a Marvel guy. But I really loved the environment. The environment at Marvel was great. Joe Quesada was not unlike Dick Giordano in the sense he was a boss who had also been a freelancer. So he kind of created this really nice working environment for those 5 or 6 years, from 2001 to about 2008 when I was doing most of my work there. But it was actually Jimmy Palmiotti said to me around about 2002, he said, why are you doing all this stuff for this work for hire? And I was like, well, it's amazing, isn't it? You know, I'm writing 4 of the top 5 books this month, you know, and he was like, that's no big deal. He said, you've got to lay down the mark for your, you know, who you were. You can't just be part of like the Marvel story or the DC story. He said, you've got to sort of tell your own story. Like at the end of your career, you'll look back and regret it if all you've ever done is company characters. And I was like, I really thought of that. And it had never been an ambition, you know, because I was a fanboy who wanted to do this stuff. And I sat down and I thought, I'm going to give it a try. But, you know, I'll try one. And I did Wanted. And that was the very first one I ever tried. And before the book came out, we'd sold the movie rights. Like Universal had called up and asked about the rights. And I thought it was a prank call. It was one of those weird things where you think, yeah, of course. You know, so some guy says, hey, I'm calling from Hollywood and I'd like to buy your stupid first issue. You know? And it was, so before the thing actually came out, we'd sold the movie rights. And I was like, hang on a minute, maybe Jimmy was right. You know, this is pretty cool, you know? And like, and then what looked like a series of fantastic career moves was actually a series of just happy accidents like that. So I always did what I wanted to do, really, you know, what I just felt would be fun. So, for example, when I was doing Ultimates was pretty much Marvel's #1, #2 book for the whole 5-6 years that it ran. And Joe said to me, you should keep doing this. And I was like, I'm done. You know, the story's it's over, you know. And he said to me, the Wolverine stuff went down great. You should do more. And I was like, yeah, I've told that story. And I would go off and do something like American Jesus. You know, I'd go and do like a little book that nobody was reading or anything. So to answer your question from earlier, which I didn't answer, was I've never followed the cash, weirdly. The cash has luckily come when I'm doing what I want to do. But that was the lesson I learned from the 90s. Which was if you follow the cash, if you try and find an audience, you won't. But if you do something you personally love and you really want to do, that enthusiasm is really contagious. And other people, if you like it, will maybe like the story too. And I think that's the most valuable lesson I'd say to any creator, to go for the thing you want. And I'll give you another example. Whenever I was leaving Marvel, I just had Wanted out as a movie, and Kick-Ass was in production, but we hadn't sold it. I mean, Kick-Ass is a very interesting story. That what happened was the movie got made privately financed with no studio backing. No studio wanted it, and Matthew Vaughn, the director, went off and made the movie, and then sold it to the studio after he'd made a movie they said they didn't want. It was really bizarre. So I didn't know. I had a huge tax bill at the time. I remember I had like no cash, and this was maybe 2009, late 2009. And no idea whether Kick-Ass was even getting picked up by a studio or anything, you know. And Marvel said to me, if you sign up for another 3 years and come back and do Wolverine and all that kind of stuff, we'll give you $1 million. And I was like, that's a lot of money, you know. And they were like, we'll give you $1 million. We'll send you the check now for $1 million. And I remember I had an overdraft and a big tax bill, and I had no cash. And I was like, I'm going to go and just do my own stuff. and they said, "Are you crazy?" They said, "It'll take you 6 months to get the comic together. Then it'll take you a few months for it to come out, and then you don't get paid with creator owns for about another 6 months. By the time the cash comes back." Said, "So you've got a tax bill to pay, because I know the guys really well, And they said, "We'll give you this cash now, but you have to sign with us for 3 months." And I was like, "I'm just going to go and do my own stuff." And I would often created all the stuff that eventually became Millar World, but it was a hell of a risk in hindsight, And I was borrowing money from the bank sometimes to pay the artists, because I would pay the artists. Not initially. Guys like Johnny worked for free up front and then got the money on the back end, but a lot of the artists couldn't afford to take a year off to come and do a Millar World project, so I would have to match their Marvel rates and give them that money up front and then get that money back later, So it was a crazy time, and it was very tempting, when somebody puts a check down for that kind of money, you're like, you're inclined to say yes. But like I say, I've always stupidly just felt it'll all be okay and I'll just do what I love and then everything will be fine.
Mark, I wanted to ask you about the artist relationship in terms of creator ownership. And everything you've been talking about segs really nicely into this topic. The fact that you weren't, thinking in terms of creator ownership when you first get into this game, I wasn't sure if that was something you discovered in the 80s when you're reading Alan Moore essays, and planting those seeds. But if I understand right, you have a 50-50 split with all of your artists in terms of ownership?
Yeah.
I think it's commendable. I mean, I certainly know writers who do creator ownership and work out, especially I'll pay in advance deals where they keep that ownership themselves. So it's not a given that this kind of relationship is 50-50. So I commend you for that. I that's the best. Can you talk about what motivated that? I'm sure you could have done this several different ways.
I think it's just common decency, I think an artist will spend more time on the project than you will, so there's that, so the idea of him making less money just seems ridiculous, so the whole thing at Millar World, from 2003 when I started it up until 2017 when we sold it, the deal was very, very simple. You would eventually, we had the money, you would be paid at least your Marvel or DC page rate, $1,000 a page or whatever, you'd be paid your Marvel and DC rate, and you would have a 50% stake in the property if anything happened with it, like merchandise, because we'd kick-ass merchandise, we had kick-ass Pez dispensers and everything. So like anything like that, if I make 50 cents, you make 50 cents, and that's what I said to everybody. And it's funny, people said to me, maybe, why don't you do it like 55, 45 or something like that, And I was like, but then people get a bit funny, but 50-50, everybody's happy with. No matter how cranky somebody is, 50-50, nobody can really complain about, So my relationship with all the artists is all great, because I've always said that. And the one thing I did do, which was eventually quite a lot of dough, was I said to the guys, I'll also have my executive producer rate with you as well, So on Wanted, I was given a token executive producer thing, and so was JG as well, JG Jones. But by the time I was on Kick-Ass, I was properly producing, so I was on set, I was reading all the scripts, I was watching the auditions, I was doing all this stuff. And I said to the guys, I'll half my producer fees as well. So, I mean, it ended up being quite a chunk of money. And this was the same for everything, because anytime we sold something like Starlight to Fox or Nemesis to Warner Brothers and everything, my producer fee was quite substantial, as well as the rights, and I would always half it with the artist as well. And then when we sold the company, some people said to me, "Are you still going to half this with the artists?" And I was like, "Yes, we co-own this stuff, So whenever we sold the company to Netflix, part of the deal was for me to stay on and work in-house as an executive at Netflix and create new material in-house, new IP. Which is a different thing, but but the actual deal of selling Millar World to Netflix, was right down the middle. We just did an absolute 50-50, and all the artists were delighted. I mean, I think in some ways I kind of ruined the comics industry, and I worried I kind of ruined the comics industry because so many people have taken time off.
It's been ruined several times. I don't think you can credit yourself for that.
Well, you know what? I am super glad to get these two pieces on the record about Netflix and the deals as a writer with the artists, because a lot of the problems that I have with the comics that I see on the racks are very clear, like Netflix pitch comics that they look at. This is conjecture. This is me talking. They could almost give a crap about the medium of comics, and they're just trying to like use my beloved medium that I freaking love and adore to try to advance themselves in this film game. And then
Yeah.
also there's so many poor man's Stan Lee type characters out there who write 5 books. They pay a page rate or something, man, and just throw things at the wall, see what sticks, and generate royalties off of all that stuff when they have minions just drawn in their little hole.
Yeah, I don't take human decency for granted in this kind of thing, because comics history is just it's written, in indecency, I guess, for lack of a better term. But I mean, it's very rare to have that kind of equal split historically. So
I think that's some American shit, probably, man.
it might be. It might be.
I think it's interesting though, because I kind of do the opposite of the Netflix pitch comics. And as people used to always say to me, "Oh yeah, are you just doing this stuff to sell it as a movie?" And I was like, I would just sell it as a movie if I wanted to sell it as a movie, and I'd keep all the money. I love comics. I don't want to be a screenwriter. So what I do now, weirdly, is the complete opposite. And what I do is I work in-house at Netflix and I create an IP. And the IP will be a television show or a movie. And probably a half to 3/4 of what I'm creating in-house, I'm bringing out as a comic later, but it's owned by Netflix. So the deal is a completely different thing now. It's not like when I had Millar World, So Magic Order was the first one of these. There's Magic Order, Sharky, Space Bandits, and then some of the new ones that's coming up, Prodigy as well, and some of the new ones that's coming up. That what happens is they'll be created as movies or television shows, and then a team of designers will work with me on the look of the characters, and the production Bible starts to get put together. And then I'll say to the guys, look, I really want to do a comic of this as well. And they will be like, could you not just work on another TV show or something? I'll be like, I love doing comics. Can you give me some time out that I can go to this comic? And they're like, cool. So I go away and they say to me, look, if you're going to do a comic, I want the best artist in the world. And I was like, okay, give me a gigantic page rate and I'll go and get Olivier Coipel. So I'll go away and I get Olivier to draw Magic Order, but he's working from a production Bible kind of thing. So it's interesting that all the ones since the Netflix sale, it's kind of the opposite, where it starts as a TV show or a movie, and then not that it's adapted as a comic, but it's a separate thing, So it's created as another entity. But because I love comics so much, I mean, Netflix are not comic publishers, but I said to them whenever I signed my deal, I says, I can't disappear for 10 years and just work in-house at Netflix and not have a presence in comics. I love comics. I didn't see comics as a stepping stone to work in film and television. And I said, when I was cutting my deal for this job, I said, will you let me do a certain amount of comics every year and give me crazy page rates to get the best artists in the world? And they were like, yeah, okay. And it's perfect, it's great. And it's quite bulletproof with the comic book recession and everything, which is great, because the artists are getting the most phenomenal rates. And whenever the TV shows are out, these books are going to sell gangbusters and trades, so the artists are going to make a lot of royalties. Because I'm on staff, actually, I won't make any royalties, which is crazy, But but I don't care, I mean, I love doing comics, and the idea of 10 years not doing them would be unthinkable.
Mark, can you talk about the strengths of comics compared to TV and movies?
There's the very obvious thing, which is budget. Like the Jupiter's Legacy TV show is expensive. It's 100 million. You've got over 10 million an episode, but there has to be some conversations in it. So that it's not super expensive all the time. It can't be 30 million an episode. It has to be around 10 million an episode. Whereas comics doesn't have those limitations. I mean, if you're doing a soap opera, it's all dialogue. You don't have any spaceships crashing into the Empire State Building or anything, because you can't afford to do that stuff. But what's beautiful about comics is that a conversation costs the same to draw as the most outrageous Warren Ellis kind of authority, planetary type big scale stuff. And I love that about comics, the fact that your imagination is the only limitation. Whatever you can come up with, it's fine, just do it. And it's also a bit of a pirate medium as well. Like Netflix is good. I've got to say, Netflix have never given me any grief. They're really great to work for. But I've heard at studios, people giving me notes and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, which is a consideration in comics. I think comics is like a pirate medium. You can just go off and do anything you want. And even if you're doing something huge, like Superman or Batman or X-Men or something, you can get in stuff that you'd be surprised at, you can pretty much write about what you want, which is lovely. So I think the fact nobody's watching comics is great. There's no legal teams looking at it and all this kind of stuff. And that's what I love about it. I love the idea of it being something that it's a bit dangerous and it's kept under your bed. And your mum would rather you didn't read them when you were a kid, but it's cool that you do. Like Howard Chaykin. I mean, my God, Howard Chaykin was the first time I was ashamed to have a comic in the house when I was maybe 12 or 13.
Yeah, you had Black Kiss too, huh?
Well, American Flag, I got American Flag issue 1. And I don't know, I think I got it really cheap actually, because I could normally not afford that many books. And when I was that age, I would only buy books that had Superman on them. So I was buying maybe 5 comics a month. And I think I saw American Flag for 10p, like about 15 cents. And that's at a junk store kind of thing, issue 1. And I read it and it was like the adult world opening up in front of me, And I instantly fell in love with Howard. I mean, Howard just became an idol to me then. Like he's up there in my Mount Rushmore with Alan Moore and Frank Miller. I absolutely love Howard, But I remember actually my mum, if she found something like American Flag, she would be horrified and probably make me throw out all my comics. So I had to kind of hide it, and I hid it between some DC Presents or some Brave and the Bold or something like that, And there's something quite exciting about that, And I think comics is the last place kind of like this.
Mark, are all of your creative ambitions collaborative? Like, is there a novel in the works, something that you want to have complete 100% agency over?
What's better than comics? I think like comics is one of those lovely things when 1 + 1 = 3. Like me plus Frank Whiteley is so much more interesting than me. So I love the idea of working with the best artists who bring things out in my stories that I didn't even know were in there.
That was me in a roundabout way trying to see if you have some single man comics coming out at some point, man.
Mark, another piece that I think of when I think of you is, I don't know if brand conscious is the right way to say this, but when Millar World was announced a decade ago or something, it made big waves, just the announcement. You seemed very good at publicity, selling your work, something that a lot of cartoonists are notoriously poor at. Does that come naturally? Are you working with somebody, at that stage to put this stuff together?
No, it was literally just me making up crazy ideas, Like I've always thought, if you're into something, don't be shy about it. If you're enjoying it, don't hide it under a bushel. Like I've spoken to pals at conventions and they've said to me, "Oh man, I'd be so embarrassed to do what you do." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And they were like, "Are you not ashamed to say this is the greatest comic you've ever read?" And I was like, "Well, I'm not going to say it's the 5th greatest comic you've ever read." You've got to advertise it as like, you've got to make somebody part of their $2.99 as it was back then, And I've never seen the point in underselling. Ultimately it is a business, and you want people to check out your book. There's no creative person in the world doesn't want as wide an audience as possible. Anyone who says they don't is lying. Otherwise you would not let it leave the house. You would put these things under your bed. So everybody wants an audience. So I really find it fun. Like I remember for Kick-Ass, I got friends to make a viral video with me of a guy dressing up as a superhero and this is back when viral videos were kind of new-ish, So I got a guy dressed up as a superhero getting into a park and taking on some muggers who were beating up a guy. And it's the scene from Kick-Ass issue 2, and which they used in the movie as well. And I got a friend to put it up on YouTube, so it wasn't connected with me or anything. And then on the Millar World website, I said, "Hey, check this out. There's a guy trying to be a superhero." And it actually got a lot of views. It got tons of views, and it ended up back in the day when there was not that much to see in the world of comics. Like Tim Story was doing a Fantastic Four movie or something like that. There wasn't that much exciting stuff going on, and it kind of went everywhere for a little bit. And then I said, "Oh, this character Kick-Ass, this guy's claiming to be. Here's a comic book about him." So I would do little fun things like that, to kind of try and get people interested. I mean, one of the daft ones, I got a pal to Photoshop a picture of Superior issue 1 into Barack Obama's hands while he's walking onto Air Force One, and he's got a pile of papers and he's got Superior issue 1. And it kind of went everywhere for about 12 hours, And then people realized, I mean, now people wouldn't fall for this stuff, but back in 2009, 2010, people kind of fell for this. And one of my favorite ones was I said, "Look, I've got some money from the Wanted movie and I'm going to put it all into advertising my new book." And everybody said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "You'll find out tomorrow. Anyone passing Times Square is in for a big surprise." And I got a friend to Photoshop the cover of Nemesis issue 1 and put it up on a billboard in Times Square, right? Just a Photoshop, right? And we put it up online, and people were like, "Oh my god, this must have cost millions of dollars," you know? And it kind of went everywhere for like 5 hours. And then by the time America kind of woke up and people were sort of heading to work in New York, guys were taking pictures of it and debunking it. But what that did was it brought me a second wave of stories 5 hours later. So people were just talking about it all day, and then when the book came out, we sold tons of copies. It was great. Now, I love that stuff. I find it really fun. So, I mean, my God, I've never used an agency. It's really just me and my pals sitting having a beer, coming up with crazy plans.
That's kayfabe, man.
Yeah, that's great.
That's awesome.
Did you ever try this kind of marketing when you were at Marvel or DC? And if so, how did they respond? Were they on board?
Are you behind the Century? Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Well, Marvel, there was a little bit of that stuff going on. There was a little bit. I mean, the good thing about Marvel actually was the Ultimate line was really exciting in itself, because Marvel sales had sort of been going down in the late 90s. It's the other side of 95, Marvel was struggling, and they were going through a lot of sackings and everything. You know, things were pretty tough at Marvel. And it got to the point, obviously, they were almost filing for Chapter 11. It was terrible, and they couldn't afford to have a coffee machine anymore in the office and everything. It was absolutely crazy, and there was rumours of checks getting bounced and everything. So Bill James coming in with Joe Quesada and coming up with the Ultimate line was really, really exciting. So and we were getting into Walmarts and all that kind of stuff. So you almost didn't need to do much with that. Like, it was kind of all done for you. Like, here's a new Spider-Man, here's the new Avengers, here's the new X-Men. Like, that was exciting enough that retailers were like, okay, we're in, this is good. Like, here's a couple of quite hot writers, super hot artists, and the greatest characters of all time getting a facelift. That was enough to sell it, you know? But as time goes on, and especially as you're doing your own stuff, you have to be a little more creative. I used to try it a little bit at DC, but like I said, I used to bump heads a lot with the DC guys because they were very corporate and they would be terrified of anything like this. I can't remember the ones I did, but I did pull a few fun stunts at DC, and and I would be hauled in front of someone over the phone because I was. So it was never too scary because it was only over the phone. But I'd have guys really shouting at me, you know, telling me not to do this kind of stuff. So what I used to do with the DC guys instead is I used to prank them under false emails, and I built up a library of pranks that I did on the DC guys because it was a bit like school, you know, when you've got really strict teachers, the kids love to play a prank on the teacher. So it kind of became like that at DC, where I think I did about 20 different pranks, really elaborate stuff, where I pretend to be a Rolling Stone journalist, or I pretend to be a music guy or something like this, you know, getting in touch with DC. I pretended to be from Italian Vogue, offering a modelling shoot to editors and everything, just all this kind of stuff. And I built up a library of pranks, and that was the only thing that kept me going through my DC book.
Mark Millar, why are you trying to sell books? God damn it! Like, what can the guy possibly say, man? But also, like, just speaking to, like, it sort of goes along with the people who do the Netflix pitch comics, man. If you bring somebody from, like, the outside world to a certain kind of person in comics, they will bend over and take whatever you fucking give them, man. You know, like, that's probably the easiest prank. Like, we might have to bleep this part of the conversation, man, because, you know, editors will freaking lick balls to have, you know, some Rolling Stone editor talking to them.
Well, I mean, I did so many. I pretended to be celebrities because it was back in the day that if an email came in, you believed it, just the name. So if it was like Tom Hanks at hotmail.com, you were like, oh my God, it's Tom Hanks. People used to believe this stuff in the late 90s, you know. And my did you ever hear about the prank I played on Bendis when I went to Marvel early on at Marvel?
Please tell us.
Oh my God, it's amazing. Right. This was one of the last of these pranks. And anybody I was pals with when I was at Marvel, I used to do this stuff with. But Bendis, I had an absolute beauty. And I pretended to be David Mamet. And David Mamet is his favourite writer, right? And Joe had told us that, Joe Quesada said that David Mamet was like a huge comic fan. He was actually really into Silver Surfer, right? That was like his favourite thing. And I was like, that's really interesting. And then I thought, right, I could do something with this, right? So what I did was I started a Hotmail account, like David Mamet 1949 or something, at hotmail.com. And I contacted Bendis out of the blue. And I said, hey, Brian, I hope you don't mind me contacting you out of the blue. My name's David Mamet. I'm a playwright. Humble. And then said, like, you know, I'm a huge fan of your stuff. And Bendis had heard the Silver Surfer David Mamet thing as well. So I knew you would think this is real, you know. So I said, I'm a huge fan of your stuff. And I hope you don't think this is too much, but I wondered if we could maybe collaborate on a project together. And within about 1 second, an email came back from Bendis saying, oh my God, you're my absolute favorite writer. I heard you write comics. This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me, you know? And I said, this is awesome, you know. So I wrote back and I said, like, I can't believe it, you know, this is a marriage made in heaven because I love you too. And I said, like, why don't we do Spider-Man together? And he was like, I'm writing Spider-Man, this is perfect. You know? So I wrote back and I said, look, do you want to hear some of my ideas for Spider-Man? And he was saying, David Mamet's Spidey ideas, of course, you know. So like, I wrote this thing and it was Space Spider-Man, where Spider-Man has adventures in space. Cave Spider-Man, where things like absolute garbage, right? Like absolute garbage. And like, and Bendis is trying to be nice, right? And he's come back and saying, well, you know, some of this stuff, you know, I don't know how it would fly, you know. And I said, no, it's cool because I know there was the Clone Saga and we could actually create 4 clones of Spider-Man, have one in space, one back in prehistoric times. And Bendis was saying, well, I don't know, like, why don't I pitch some ideas at you? And then I came back and said, do you think my ideas aren't good enough for you? And Bendis said, no, not at all, you know. And and I absolutely had him on the hook. It was fantastic. And then I said, listen, if you're not going to write these stories, I'm going to go to a real writer. I'm going to try Mark Millar. And it was me, and he replied, just fuck you, Millar, fuck you, in capital letters.
This is the first time on Kayfabe where my face hurts, man.
Yeah, that's
smiling
great.
too much, man. You catfished him in modern day parlance. You fucking catfished Brian Bendis.
That's awesome. Mark, I'm curious about your what you see in the near future in comics. We're in a weird moment in time in comics. You've been through a couple comic recessions. You talked about ruining comics. What do you see in the near future for comics?
I think it's a fascinating time. Like, I'm obsessed with trends, right? I mean, the thing about comic guys is we're very comics literate, you know, so we look at the past and we can see the future from the past, you know. And I noticed when I was a teenager, I was reading an interview with Denny O'Neil, and it was around about the time the first Batman movie was coming out, you know, the Michael Keaton Batman movie. And Denny O'Neil said, you know, somebody asked him, did you ever think we would be in this position? You know, like there's a Batman movie coming out, you know, in cinemas. And he said, 10 years ago, I didn't think there was going to be an industry. He said, I came in the 60s when it was doing really well. He says, and in the 70s, it just completely collapsed. And here we are now, late 80s, the comics are doing fantastic. And as a teenager, I thought, that's interesting, because that's what made me realize it's not always the same. And like politics, things move in cycles. So you roughly get 8 years of a Democratic president, roughly followed by 8 years of a Republican president. You know, politics tends to move like a sine wave as well. It tends to go in cycles. And there's a few outliers, but generally, you know, it swings left and right. In comics, it's the same. I've noticed that there's a very successful decade like the 40s, followed by a lean decade like the 50s, followed by a very big thing like the 60s, followed by a creatively fascinating but sales-wise very poor 70s, where everything was in turmoil. Marvel Comics, I think, were down to 16 pages. The rest was ads, you know. Followed by the 80s, which is a golden age, the collapse of the 90s, a rejig in the 2000s. And I think it's been quite a fallow decade, you know, like there's been a lot of stunts over the last 10 years to boost sales, you know, like 60, 80% discounts to stores and everything. But if you look at the overall numbers, certainly in the last 5 years, it's been weak. And there's much less excitement about comics overall, not to discredit what some people are doing, because there's some amazing comics out there, but just as the industry as a whole, we know footfall in comic stores is less than it was. So I'm convinced, though, I've always said that 2020 is the beginning of the rebirth of comics. I know that's a weird thing to say right now in the middle of COVID and, you know, a global pandemic multiplied by a recession, multiplied by Marvel fatigue, you know, coming from the movies and everything, you know. But I'm utterly convinced that towards the end of this year, we have the beginning of a rebirth of comics, and we're going to get into the best decades we've ever had as creators. So it sounds odd, but I actually see good times ahead. I think in the short term, there's bad times. I think that it's inevitable. Half of the comic stores out there were dangling by a thread already. Like a lot of my friends are retailers, and they didn't get into this for the money. They get into it because they loved it, and they just were making a living are just keeping their head above the water. But something like this, you know, a third of these stores might not reopen, or a quarter of these stores might not reopen at the end of this. That is going to have not an instant impact, but you're going to see sales on books accordingly going down a certain percentage as well. And then you have a contagion effect that will probably happen towards the end of the year, because the stores that were just managing to keep their head above the water after COVID are going to be not having as many books on the market that they used to sell and so on. So, I mean, like every recession, it's going to have a multiplier effect. But I do think that what will come from this is ingenuity, you know, and it's going to be really hard. And I've got so many friends in retail and so many friends who are creators I'm really worried about. I mean, I'm very, very lucky to be on a salary. You know, I work at Netflix, but a lot of my friends who are working at Marvel and DC, it's check to check. I worked like that for most of my career. And that's going to be a scary time. But I do think the interesting thing about comic people is they tend to be pretty smart and they tend to be pretty ingenious. And all we need is a pen and paper. I mean, you cannot stop us. You know, you could throw us in a jail and we will still manage to do comic books. But we'll get a pen off somebody and we'll get a paper off somebody and we'll still do comics, you know? So I think that no matter how bad this year gets, and I do think it's going to be really hard, I think that something good will spring up out of it. And I'm not entirely sure what it is, whether it's a revolution in digital or whatever, you know, if it becomes something a bit more like music, where you've got speciality stores like vinyl stores, you know, where you get maybe digital monthlies, and then you get very expensive collector's edition comic store stuff. I don't know. I mean, somebody smarter than me, I think, will figure this out. But every 20 years, somebody comes along and does it. And I think it'll be on the back of younger creators coming in too, because I think that's what's really missing just now. You know, that historically, you tend to have every 20 years some new talent comes in and it lifts all ships. So back in 2000s, Bendis and I were like two unlikely guys, you know, but came in and sold loads of books at Marvel, you know. 20 years before that, you had Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Marv Wolfman, those guys, you know, in 1980. 20 years before that, it was Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. 20 years before that, it was Siegel and Schuster and Gardner Fox and all the Golden Age guys. So roughly every 20 years, there's new people come in with a really, really exciting new take that then pulls the industry up for a decade, and then you have a gentle decline. And I've noticed that it tends to also follow, you usually get about 5 good years at Marvel, where there's, creatively I'm talking about, 5 good years at DC, 5 good years of new characters, then 5 years of flux. And I think we're just coming out of the 5 years of flux, you know. So I think that 2001 to 2006, broadly, Marvel were top dog. 2006 to 2012, DC were ruling. You know, they were doing some great stuff, their All-Star line and everything. Marvel seemed to fall by the wayside a little. Then Image, I think, had a great 5 years. There was Saga and all those books coming out, you know. But I think the last four years or so, I don't think there's been any massive seismic books. There's been nothing that's pulling people into stores the way that you had Saga or Civil War or Walking Dead, all this kind of stuff. There's nothing new that's really appeared in that time. But I do think there's probably people who are about 28 to 30 right now who are like, why are there guys at 50 writing these books? You know, like, these guys must die. You know, so my generation of guys should be sort of moved on. You know, we'll still be working in comics, but we shouldn't be at the forefront of it, you know, and there should be some 20-somethings coming through doing stuff that we can't possibly get our heads around. And it's going to be so exciting because as a fan, I feel I really need to see that right now. And that's what I see the next couple of years.
Mark, are you conscious of books like Raina Telgemeier's Smile or Dog Boy? These are all ages books that are coming out of, you know, like a more traditional book publishing model and distribution system, but selling millions of copies of books, you know, into libraries and into this, what I'm very hopeful is a new generation of readers. But is that something that you're conscious of as a reader, as a comics person?
As a guy standing in public transport and everything, I see it, which is interesting. Like Dog Boy, I remember seeing like this tiny little kid who was about 5 or something, you know, barely able to read, sitting reading Dog Boy. I was in a line at an airport waiting to get boarded, and I saw this kid sitting reading it. And then when I went on the plane, I saw a girl who was about 19 sitting reading Dog Boy, and I was like, what the hell is this? This was years back. And I Googled it, and I was fascinated because that's what I'm talking about, you know, stuff that's not on my radar. You know, that when we're creators, I think we extrapolate what we grew up with. So for me, I grew up with the 80s comics, so then when I got to sit in the throne in the 2000s, everything was a homage to Alan Moore and Frank Miller and all the stuff I grew up with in the 80s. But the influences for this current generation will be people who were born in the 1990s, really. So Dog Boy makes absolute perfect sense. Those guys in a way that it maybe wouldn't connect with me. Like my oldest daughter, she grew up in the time of Pokemon. Like Pokemon was, as a toddler, she adored Pokemon. So when she draws, there's a slight Pokemon edge to her artwork and everything. And my influences are Kurt Swan and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. So, but that's the way pop culture should be. It should always be something new coming through. And we write and draw everything we loved as kids once we get a chance to be the adult doing that stuff. So the people who grew up in 90s TV shows and everything, these guys are just coming into their own now. And I cannot wait to see what they do. I mean, imagine somebody like that coming in and revolutionizing Marvel. Like Marvel's been, it's ruled in terms of pop culture for the last 10 years, but they've played it safe. There's nothing experimental going on at Marvel since Disney bought them. And I remember at the time the email going out to all the freelancers saying, "Great news, Disney's bought Marvel." And I was like, oh, to me it felt like, in Independence Day when you saw the ship coming over New York, and I was like, this isn't great news. We're being sold this is great news, but ultimately this means Spider-Man is going to become Mickey Mouse, But I would love to see people coming in who are radical and completely shaking up Marvel and DC from a writer and artist point of view.
We're coming up to the end of our time here. I don't want to leave the conversation without thanking Brendan McCarthy for connecting us to even make this possible. But Mark, when you and I we were in correspondence by way of email to set this whole thing up, it's clear that you listen to the interviews that we post up there, but you also kind of like gave me a little illustration of like what your work day is like, beginning at like 8 a.m., going through lunch, working through dinner, or eating dinner super late. But you put in like a solid 10, 11 hours a day or something, at least it seems. How do you even have time to listen to this stuff as a writer? Can you have things playing in your mind, like in your ears while you're writing?
I just spend less time with the people in my life who really matter. So what I mean, in all honesty, like if you're writing, you cannot hear dialogue. You just can't, And I'm so jealous of my artist pals because they have the radio on and they have CDs on and things, and they'll just sit and draw and listen away, And I would love that. There are podcasts. I mean, it'd be lovely to just listen to podcasts all day, but I can't. So what I do is at the end of my working day, my little 1 hour treat to myself, or in the case of you guys, 90 minutes, 120 minutes sometimes, is I just treat my wife thinks I'm still working because I'm at the other end of the house and she can't see. So I'm going to say I was working really hard, but I'll listen to you guys for like 90 minutes and it's my little treat at the end of the day. But it's funny you say, I mean, the way my work day works, I was talking to a pal about this recently, and I was saying it is weird because it takes me a couple of hours to get into what I'm doing, like to really get into it. And then it takes a couple of hours to come back to the real world as well. And it sounds so pretentious, right? And I'm almost embarrassed saying it. This is one of the few places we can say it because you probably feel the same way, but one of my pals described it so brilliantly. And he said to me, it's like getting high or it's like going down a mine. He says that it takes you a little while to get down the mine to go and do your work. You're in that elevator going down the mine and you head off and you do your work. And then you have a shower and everything. And then you've got to come back up again, to be in the real world. And I think writing and drawing is a bit like that, that you have to completely disassociate yourself from everything. And that takes a couple hours. And then you get maybe 5 good hours of writing, and then it takes a couple of hours to come back out. And that's when you do your tweeting. You'll notice all my tweets at the beginning and the end of the day. And that's you limbering up. That's like your stretching exercises. You're on Facebook a little bit, you're emailing pals and things. But seeing those 5 hours where you're really going at it, like you can't stop and eat, it's like being in a trance. It really is. It's really weird, but you have to give it your full focus. You don't even realize you're hungry. So you blast on with it. And if somebody phones you, it'd be a nightmare. It'd be like waking somebody up in the middle of a dream. You've got to actually stay with it. So I switch off the phones. I've got a lock on the door. There's 2 doors before you get to my office, and I lock both doors. It's like a nuclear silo. I lock both doors so the kids can't come and ask me something, And And I just hope nobody has a heart attack or something like that, because I'm never going to help. I'm off doing my comic stuff in here, And then when I come back out, I'm depressurized, and I'm ready for the real world again. And I come out and I have dinner with the family and everything, and then I put the kids to bed, fall asleep, and then it all starts over again.
Everything you just said is amplified about 5 to 10 times just from this conversation, and I don't know when I'm gonna come down from this. Like, I'm so excited to get back to the drawing board and just put in some freaking hours, man. Jimmy, do you have anything, or can we wrap things up?
Yeah, we can wrap things up. What a great conversation. Thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
No, I mean, can I just say to you guys, I know Howard Chaykin said something similar, that little intro at the start of Howard. But what I love about this is that I didn't realize how much I was missing this until I found you two. And it was Brendan about 6 weeks ago, dropped me a line and he said, "Have you seen these guys?" I was like, no, what's this? He said, "Check this out. You're going to love this." And I spent like 4 hours. I just was going through everything. And I was reading like analyses of issues of Wizard and things like that. But I was loving it. And I realized, I think especially guys like me or Frank Millar or whatever, the guys who kind of work in a couple of industries, we tend to talk mainstream all the time, to the point where I think we actually circumnavigate our language so that mainstream journalists understand what we're talking about. So I do find myself, even without thinking about it, whenever I reference a comic, I give it context and explain what that is and when it came out. And there's something so lovely about your own people. Like when you first discover a comic store, do you remember what it was like when you first discovered the comic store as a kid? And you're like, this is who I am. Like, you're not quite sure. You're not that interested in the stuff. Your friends are into this music. Your other pals are into football. But you're drawing Green Lantern. It's like you don't quite figure out where you fit until you walk into a comic store and you're like, this is my world, And that existed for a long time, especially in the 80s. You had the Comics Journal, the 90s, you had Wizards and everything. And there was a lot of really good comics journalism. And I hadn't noticed until quite recently how much it was gone. So, I mean, God bless them, the websites that are doing this stuff, they're just trying to survive. So they have to create these clickbait things. But I don't even check it out anymore. Like, I used to start my day by checking out the comic websites. I don't even look at it. So it's like 15 things you didn't know about Thanos and 24 things you didn't need to know or something like that. I don't need to read that stuff, So to actually, that excitement I felt when I saw my first comics journal, and it was like a 72-page interview with Will Eisner or something like that. It's like, the depth of it. I've really missed it. And it's like I've been eating chocolate for 10 years, and that suddenly there's a nice steak and potatoes and veg, something that's good for you is there. So, I mean, I don't know how long you guys are planning to do this, but I hope forever, because there's so many interesting personalities in comics. There's so many crazies. There's so many lovely people and all that, but they're great for interviews, and nobody else is doing it. Robert Rodriguez, I don't know if you guys have seen what he's doing, where he interviews different directors. He does a thing on his channel. We don't get it in Scotland, but Robert's a pal of mine, and he sends me DVDs of them, right? So he'll interview George Miller for an hour, or he'll interview Tarantino for 2 hours and everything, and it's great because it's a director just talking about being a director to another director, And I always thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a comic version of that? Like comedians in cars getting coffee, where it's two comedians chatting as well. And I always thought I'd love to go to John Romita's studio and sit with him and his dad and just go through his original artwork and all that, and just chat for 2 hours. And it's stuff that only guys like us would really care about, like don't even think about the mainstream audience. But you guys have saved me the effort. You guys are actually doing it. And I think you're doing it so much better than I would. I love it.
Heck of a compliment, man.
Yeah, I don't know what to say after that.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Mark, thank you very much.
Not at all. And I've noticed, guys, can you actually see me? I've realised it's gone dark outside. A silhouette. Can you still see me?
Yeah. We haven't seen your shadow get cast differently, so that's the only faulty piece of the green screen you have behind you with that very palatial estate. Thanks again, Mark.
This is my wife's office, actually. Like I'm doing my office up to look like the DC office of 1958.
Are you bullshitting or no?
No, seriously, this is my wife's office.
No, I'm talking about the DC thing.
DC thing, yeah. So the reason, the very far end of the house is my office, and the reception is terrible for Zoom. It's just too far away from wherever the modem and everything is, you know. So like I come into my wife's office and use her computer for it instead. So like usually her office is a bit more sophisticated than mine. It looks nice, you know. Whereas I've got two offices. I've got one office I've done up to look kind of like Sherlock Holmes' study. So it's a bit like Batman meets Sherlock Holmes, where there's microscopes and vials of chemicals and things like this, you know. And you know, it's got like a late 19th century vibe to it, you know. And then there's my office in the house. And my office in the house, I'm in the middle of doing up to look exactly like a 1958 DC office. It's all teak, mid-century furniture and everything, and it's got a comic rack and everything, you know. And I think if I ever get dementia and I walk into this room in the future, I'm going to be totally confused. Because other than my computer, everything is from the 50s.
Mark, can we do it again sometime in the future? Maybe you could haul in one of your long boxes, show off some of the stuff you have, man. But until that day, what you just said is a big fish story, man. So I need to see some proof of some Sherlock Holmes office work. I need to see this DC office.
Will I try and take you down to my office just now? I could lift the laptop and...
Let's do it.
Sure.
Let's do it, man.
This suddenly feels like big budget. We're doing a big budget there.
Yeah, this is like, you know, Blair Witch or something, man. So be careful.
Here we go. So like, I think the kids are in bed. So... Right.
And we're just being quiet because the camera goes on us. So.
All right, cool. I'll put the lights on here. Now the signal will probably get really bad here. So like, let me know if it cuts out, because it's under the house and away along to one side here. So now remember, this is early days. God, it's freezing down there. Now this is an old cellar. This house is 300 years old. So...
Oh man, we lost them.
Are you still here?
Yes.
Lost me?
No, we got you.
Are we back?
Yep.
We're back?
Yes.
Oh, great. Now, this is good. This is a corridor I didn't know we had when we bought the house. It was behind a wall. So I'm going to turn it into a big original comic art corridor. So like all this stuff here, I've got Olivia Coipel. This is all from books I've done. So we've got like Dave Gibbons, Olivia Coipel, Matteo Scalera and everything. And I'm going to run these all the way down here. So like, and it goes away around the corridor. I found an old spooky staircase that I didn't know we had as well, you know. That was behind the wall. And this is my office is in here. Hang on. So this is my DC of the 50s kind of look. Hang on.
It's got that Mad Men vibe to it.
It's early days. I'm just putting it together just now. But like probably in about a month's time, I'll have everything that I want. 50 style clock, spinner rack, all this stuff. So like I might have done it a little too soon, but in a month's time, I'll send you a picture, you know, and you'll see it all done. But this end of the house is the bit that I try and keep the kids away from. This is where I do pretend to do all my work while I'm listening to you guys.
Yeah, just traversing the house will keep you skinny. There's that one little corridor that's the Faraday cage.
Yes.
And I think he'll come back. Yep, he came back.
You're back.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just that one little nook that has maybe some rebar. Well, there ain't no rebar in a 300-year-old house. Never mind. Mark, thanks a lot.
Not at all. And listen, give me a shout anytime. We should do this every night.
Well, just real quick before we split, what are you working on at this very moment? Anything that you want to plug, let the people know that's out there or whatever?
Well, it's interesting. I obviously didn't realize all the comic stores were going to be closed, but I plan to take this year out to catch up. So what I was doing was, my last book came out in February, American Jesus, and I think the trade of it is actually out this week or next week. But I've got nothing coming out till next Easter. I'm doing like Jupiter's Legacy. The next volume of Jupiter's Legacy will be coming out after the television show on Netflix. So I've written that already, and the sequel to The Magic Order with Olivia Coipel, which Olivia is drawing just now. You know? So like those things are not out for like a year. This is like the worst pitch ever, isn't it? You know, normally I'm pretty good at saying, oh yeah, you should buy my new book, it's out now and everything. You've got a year to wait for this stuff. Everybody's going to forget by the time it comes out, but I promise it is good. It's really good stuff.
Well, let's do it again whenever the stuff's out there, man. And before we split, the only thing that I would ask is that you forward the final video that we post to some of your collaborators, so that we could inevitably get a heap of Mark Millar stories. Maybe make a whole singular video of just those.
Who else have you guys got coming up soon? Then, are you able to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. Like, well, I mean, we could tell you. You know what? We're gonna wrap it up. Boom.